So I consider this an unprecedented event to get 5 people who have spent, a huge amount of years studying this, analyzing this, thinking about this, talking about it, debating it, writing books, to get them together in one room to speak to you, to speak to our live stream audience, and to speak to people now and in the future who will end up watching this video. This, to me, is the most accurate source of information on GMOs on the planet. All the people here have no agenda. They're not in the seed business. They don't own anything related. They are just truth seekers that are on your side who, for whatever reason, have decided to take their time to fight so the public gets the truth, and we're very grateful to them. So I'd like to open up by asking each of you to just tell me what you're doing. In other words, of all the things in life you could do, you took all your time, you're researching a subject like GMOs, you must feel that there's something important here, because when I tell people about this, a lot of people shrug like, yeah, GMOs, no big deal. I just went to a movie, a pro-GMO movie 2 weeks ago that someone put out, talking about how the benefits of GMOs. And at the end, they asked people, are you more open to GMOs? And 3/4 of the room raised their hand. So a lot of people are feeling like GMOs are no big deal. I mean, no problem. So you obviously, if you are writing books and lecturing and spending all your time, you must have some much different thought than what a lot of people I know think. So could you each state what's going on? Why are you writing books about GMO? Why is this such an important topic? Why is it necessary for you to put your life into a subject like GMOs when you could be using your time and efforts on something else? You must think there's some important reason that the general public or a lot of people are not aware of. So if you could answer that, each of you, to start, that would be good.
All right, well, I'll just start with the hell. I mean, I suppose the question, what else would I be doing in life? What am I going to do? Go start playing tennis, 3 times a week at the local Trump club? Probably unlikely. But I suppose the question is why. I'm a journalist. My background is in investigative reporting, and I've also been covering environmental stories for a long time, several decades now. And I don't write exclusively about GMOs, but I do write about the environmental challenges of our time. I've just written a book called Seeds of Resistance, The Struggle for Our Food Supply. And as part of that book, it's not the whole book, but anyway, as part of that book, I talk about GMOs and explore what basically the status of GMOs in our food system and what that means. Why is that important to me? Because I remember back 25 years ago when GMOs were first introduced into the United States. And there was a lot of discussion about this brand new technology that was going to feed a lot of hungry people, that was going to increase crop yields, and it was just going to do it with the slight manipulation of the genetic codes. And suddenly, within several years of the discussion beginning, these seeds were suddenly widespread across the food system of the United States and soon to come the world. So the question that I began with was, what are these seeds? What are we planting in a huge amount of farm fields in this country? The companies tell us that all they're doing is shifting a gene or two. I don't know. I'm not a geneticist. That doesn't sound so simple, but it can be done. I've now seen a GMO being created. There's a gene gun that actually shoots a gene from one organism into another gene. That's literally how it happens. So as a journalist, my question radar went up, and I wanted to know, what are these new inventions that are suddenly deeply embedded in our food system? So I went out with an open mind to actually figure out what these are, and do the claims of the companies that are behind them, they're really a very small number of companies that are behind GMOs, match up to the reality on the ground. And I came up with a number of different realizations in this process, which we can talk about probably a little more without getting into too much detail right now. But that was the motive, to figure out what was going on in our food system and on our farms with the introduction of GMOs. We can get in later to some of the things that I found. Thank you.
Is this on? No? How do you turn this on? It's on now. Is it on? You can hear? Okay. Yeah, I went to NYU Law School in New York City, and I'm an environmental attorney. And so a lot of what I was concerned with and what we had been concerned with as far as protecting the environment had to do with protecting it from chemical pollution. This is industrial chemicals, agricultural chemicals, the contamination of our streams, our rivers, the human health consequences of that. And that seemed like a really, really big challenge when I was a young man to deal with that and to become part of a number of NGOs and public institutes that did that. Then genetic engineering came around. And I realized a couple things. One is that this was bringing a whole new kind of pollution to us, and one that was extremely concerning. Because with chemical pollution, it was terrible. You spray, it could contaminate groundwater, contaminate for many, many decades. But with biological pollution, when you fundamentally change the germline of bacteria, of plants and animals, and then release them into the environment, that does not end over a couple of generations. That does not dilute over time like chemical pollution. That increases, it reproduces, it disseminates, and it cannot be recalled. So that scared the you-know-what out of me. And then when I began to see that they were really engineering in ignorance, that they were engineering bacteria and releasing them, that they were engineering plants and animals and releasing them, that's when I realized that this is something I had to devote a good bit of my life to if I was going to really be a responsible environmental attorney. And that is what I do to this day. For example, right now that we are in litigation to stop the introduction of genetically engineered salmon. A small company in AquaBounty has genetically engineered the salmon with a bunch of foreign genetic material from pouts and other fish to make it grow more rapidly. Unfortunately, there's a physiological problems with those salmon, cranial issues, and what scientists have seen is that because of this physiological problems, should these genetically engineered salmon mate with native salmon, there'll be 1/3 greater death in their offspring. Well, that's pretty scary. But even worse than that, because they're larger, they'll be more attractive in mating. So you have Darwin on his head. You've got salmon who are larger, more attractive, right, for native salmon to mate with, but you'll have 1/3 greater death in the offspring. According to scientists at Purdue and others who looked at this, if 60 of those salmon were to escape, and you know that'll happen, into a population of 30,000, you'd have extinction of that native species because of this terrible arithmetic in about 30 generations. And these are the salmon, iconic salmon that we've been trying to save for so long. So that's just one example, because once those salmon escape, once they're released, you can't recall them. You can't say, oops, oops. And that terrible arithmetic of extinction will happen. So biological pollution is the poster child for the precautionary principle. It is a fundamental and existential threat to the integrity of the entire biotic community. And as such, it needs to be taken very, very seriously. Now, on top of that, it has the added advantage of adding to our chemical pollution. Because Monsanto and the boys decided one of the few things that's actually been working, and we can talk about how the science in this is terribly flawed and why this revolution is never going to happen and hasn't happened in a big way. But they have invented plants that can withstand, as you guys know, they're herbicides. They're chemical companies. They said, we got to sell more chemicals. So I know what we'll do is we'll have corn and cotton and soy that is tolerant to our chemicals, Roundup, for example. That way we can aerial spray Roundup on the corn. It won't kill the corn, which it normally would have, because they're genetically engineered now to tolerate it. It'll just kill the weeds. So hundreds of millions of more pounds of Roundup have been put on our crops the last 13 years. Now, of course, the weeds have gotten resistant, so now they're moving to an element of Agent Orange, Dow Chemical, right, called 2,4-D, and now Monsanto is introducing an order because Roundup is no longer really working in many areas, dicamba. So along with this terrible biological pollution, they're using this technology to massively sell more of their chemicals and create even more chemical pollution. So a really unholy marriage. And we are currently in litigation to stop, we already stopped it once, we're going to stop again, the proliferation of this 2,4-D tolerant corn and soy and cotton. We're right in the middle of that litigation right now, and we're right in the middle of the litigation to stop dicamba. And this is this terribly volatile herbicide that is so volatile that the state of Arkansas just banned it. So it's great for our litigation. When a State of the Union says, hey, this is so bad we're not going to use it, why is the EPA approving it? So a number of our litigations, and we just finished some legal work and legislative work to stop the introduction of genetically engineered mosquitoes. Again, think about that out there and how you're going to control those. So just remember, when you hear chemical pollution, remember biological pollution, because it's an existential threat to us and to the entire biotic community. And those are a couple of reasons I've got involved.
Thanks. So can you turn this green one on? Is that, you guys hear me all right?
Go on.
I just want to say, first of all, that my own work has been inspired by pretty much everybody on this panel, so I'm grateful to be here. I've been watching your work for a long time. So I've spent about the last 10 years writing about some of these very issues. The evolution of big chemical companies into big food companies, which is, we've already heard, has already gone on hand in glove for 50 years or so. One thing I wanted to mention, though, so I'm an environmental journalist, but I also am a professor of what's now known as environmental humanities, which is using all the tools of cultural analysis and environmental science to think about these questions from very large and complicated perspectives. And one thing I'd like to add to this conversation, we're going to hear quite a bit about the science and about the politics, but it's also interesting to think about the structural, in this case actually infrastructural roots of a lot of these problems. And when I talk to my students about this, I ask them to think about what happened right around the end of the Second World War. As all these chemicals were being introduced and being turned from chemical weapons into chemical fertilizers, there were other things going on in the country. Most importantly, for my mind, was the construction of the interstate highway system. Now, if you think about this just for 1 second, it used to be in the United States, and it still is true in places like Europe, you used to have cities surrounded by farms. And you can still go to old cities in Europe, and you can stand on a tall building in the middle of Rome or the middle of Lyon, France, and look out and you can still see farms. And that's no longer true in American cities. So after World War II, we built the interstate highway system. If you think about it, driving down I-95, you'll often see a sign that says the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, and it's got 5 stars on it. The interstate highway system was originally built as a measure of homeland security. After the war, we'd seen the Autobahn. We decided we were going to build an infrastructure that would protect us should we ever be invaded. So we built the highway system, 95 down the East Coast. All the odd numbers go from east to west all the way across the country. The even numbers go east to west. And we have an entire grid now of something like 43,000 miles of interstate highways. These are big 4, 5, 6 lane highways. So that was all fine, well and good, intended as homeland security. What it allowed to happen, though, of course, was once all these hundreds of thousands of soldiers came back from the war, these big highways allowed them to envision living outside of the city. So now, as we all know, the suburbanization of the United States happened in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And we lost, I think the number is about 4 million small farms. They were all buried under concrete. They were turned into highways and subdivisions and shopping malls. So now what you had was cities with the big population centers surrounded by rings and rings and rings of suburbs, all built on top of farms. So among the things that happened was the complete destruction of the local food economy, which is something we'll talk about later, and the migration of food production to the Midwest, where now we have, instead of lots and lots of small farms, we have very few very large farms, all consolidated under the control of a very small number of companies. So all the things that we've already heard about being scaled up, the scaling up of chemical use, the scaling down of genetic diversity of different kinds of seeds, the scaling up of monoculture crops, all this was coincidental with the destruction of the local food economy, which happened over these last few years. I live in Baltimore. In the state of Maryland alone, we've lost 1 million acres of farms and forests to suburbanization in a very small state just in the last couple of decades. So all these farms move out to the Midwest, and they all get consolidated under these few companies, and the highways now allow, in addition to the consolidation of all these companies, the rapid and long distance movement of food. So suddenly you can have chicken nuggets created in one place and put on a truck and driven 1,500 miles to some restaurant somewhere. And that's the way Americans have now come to eat. What do we eat? We eat pizza and chicken nuggets and cheap meat. And that's because we can. It's very efficient to make that work as a business model. So the GMO thing, which we're up here to talk about, is really symptomatic of a much more complicated and deep structural problem with the food system. It's all part of it. It's not the only part of it. So I'll just be up here to kind of keep us thinking about issues from GMOs all the way down the rabbit hole into the way the food system in this country has evolved over the last few decades. I think it's more depressing than just the GMO question. It's deeper and more problematic and worth talking about.
Thank you. It's possible, I have this. It's possible that those of us who are working to successfully stop GMOs may end up protecting more people from ill health or death than any group in human history. Because GMOs may be that dangerous. If you looked at the charts that I showed earlier with more than 30 diseases rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup, that represents tens of millions or over 100 million people with diseases and disorders. And if you consider that the biotech industry's stated goal, according to a consultant of Monsanto in January of 1999 in a San Francisco conference, said that he asked the Monsanto executive to describe their ideal future. And they described a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds were genetically engineered and patented, and the consultant worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. That goal to replace the seed supply has only expanded to now include, as Andy said, insects, fish, livestock, algae, bacteria, fungus, trees, shrubs, grasses, essentially to replace nature. When you look at the fact that the number one result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects, and you multiply that by all of these species and by all of the iterations and generations of those species, the chances of coming up with something that's a disaster is pretty high. But I would submit that we've already come up with a disaster. We've already come up with pesticide delivery mechanisms in the form of GMO and BT crops with huge negative impacts on the population. And I get supported by the fact that I've surveyed 3,256 people who got better from 28 different conditions when they switched to non-GMO and largely organic food. But I've also interviewed many, many doctors who've taken people onto a non-GMO diet, because I've inspired thousands and thousands of doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets, and I've heard their reports, and the changes are predictable, consistent, and dramatic. So I am convinced that the upturn of many diseases starting in late 1990s and early 2000 is largely a result of the GMOs and the Roundup sprayed on them. And that if we, in fact, allow this generation to be, as the biotech industry wants, to eliminate the products of the billions of years of evolution and replace it with designer organisms designed for greater profit and control, then we are, as Andy said, in an irreversible situation. The only thing that lasts longer than the self-propagating genetic pollution is extinction. So I would consider this an A+ priority for human civilization and for nature. And I'm always looking for strategic ways to eliminate it in the fastest possible way to protect nature for all future generations. So it's not something we as a generation asked to do, but it's our duty and our responsibility to address it because this is the generation where the decisions are being made for all future generations.
Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. So, my background, my education began in the study of physics, and both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And physics is one of the disciplines that's probably the most rigorous in terms of producing knowledge and getting consensus amongst the community. There's very high standards of validating any claims before you'll find it in the textbooks. And after my studies, I then went to study philosophy and philosophy of science because I wanted to understand the nature of how knowledge gets produced more broadly. So I study controversies in sciences and in how these controversies lead to consensus or lack of consensus, and how knowledge gets produced in various fields, in biology and sociology, many other fields. And I started writing about gene splicing early on when the first controversies erupted in the 1970s, and published a book in 1982 called Genetic Alchemy to make people understand that this was a kind of alchemy, mixing of things that people didn't quite know what the results were going to be, but they had great hopes that it would produce a golden calf. But I also have written about other controversies, chemicals, endocrine disruptors particularly, stem cells, risk analysis, and eventually I got to GMOs. So it was a path. Wherever I see a new technology develop and where there are controversies, I tend to study it. And GMOs have many interesting and different kinds of controversies. What do foreign genes do in these new systems, in these plants? Will GMO food contribute to human health or human sickness? Will it contribute to the environment? And you can find all these controversies in the scientific literature. And I think what I typically do best at is delving into the scientific literature and trying to understand why published papers disagree about issues and what is the basis of this disagreement. And I also reached a conclusion that there really are three pillars to a democratic, free democratic society. The first is that each person has the right, the privilege, and the opportunity to vote. The second is that we have a free and independent press. And the third is that we have a free and independent scientific establishment. And all three of those are extremely important, because it's the scientific establishment that feeds public information about what's true and what's false. And there are many ways of fixing your belief, but I haven't found a better way than through the understanding of how scientists find the truth about a particular topic. So when scientists disagree, I'm usually trying to find out why there's disagreement. And that's why I started studying the issue of GMOs.
Thank you. Okay, I have a lot of questions that I took from your books that I'd like to go through. It's an ambitious list. There's like 50 questions, so the only way to realistically do it would be basically 3-minute answers. So I'm going to try to cover a lot so you don't have to get everything in every answer because it's probably in here. You don't each have to answer it, only if you feel comfortable. Anyone can answer it. But I would like to try to do 3-minute answers so I could cover a tremendous amount of topics that I think are all worth mentioning, even though I realize each one in itself could be a full panel. We'll try to go through them quick. So the first question is, and these questions are meant for the public, so I know you've answered these before, but let's get everyone clear on your thoughts on it. So the first question is, are biotech companies creating GMO seeds so they can better feed the developing world?
Apparently, perhaps, everybody kind of grimaced at that question. I think that's been an argument that's been presented. And there is, first of all, there's very little evidence that GMOs are being used to feed Americans, just starting there, since actually most GMOs are used to produce food for automobiles, basically in the United States, which I think it's like 40 to 50% at least, or for ethanol. Yeah. So most of those GMOs go into your gas tank. And it's funny, in the developing world, it's now a big, big question, is the effort of big seed companies to try to bring their patented seeds into places that have significant agriculture. And I was just in South Africa where this is a big issue now. And so the argument is that we're going to help feed people with GMOs. And the evidence does not necessarily seem to indicate that that's the case, because the way that would happen is, number one, that GMOs would offer higher yields than whatever existing agriculture system is in place. And there's actually very little evidence to suggest that actually GMOs are actually increasing the yields that are already producing in countries like that. They are actually often having the effect of compelling farmers to buy the inputs that are very important to go along with GMOs, including herbicides like Roundup when it comes to soybeans. So that's a quick answer to a much more complex question.
I didn't know we were going to start with comedy, Steve. You should have warned me. I thought it was going to be a serious question. So Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, BASF, Syngenta, and ChemChina, they're all chemical companies. They don't make their money on feeding anybody. They make their money on selling chemicals. And they have utilized this technology to create plants and crops that require hundreds of millions or more pounds of their chemicals, which feeds their bottom line. That's what they do. We may like that or not like that, but the idea that it has anything to do with feeding the world, that Monsanto is devoted to, or in any fashion, or DuPont or Dow feeding the world is that's just trying to whitewash their technology. And as Mark was saying, I also want to just really point out that over 55% of our cropland in the United States is in corn and soy, genetically engineered corn and soy. 40% of that, 45% goes into cars. Another 40% goes to feed the animals in these horrible animal factories, including dairies. These animals, including dairy cows, should not be eating corn, but they feed it to them anyway because that's how they feed their bottom line. A huge percentage of it goes into high fructose corn syrup, and there's a little bit of sweet corn over there, right? Same thing with soy. Chicken factories, gasoline, just like, and soy lecithin. Very little of that soy is actually fed to anybody. So the vast majority of our cropland now, I think 58% last time I looked, is actually in these commodity crops. So it does not increase yield. As a matter of fact, there's a 5% yield drag on genetically engineered soy, 5% less. But it wouldn't make any difference even if it did increase yield, because it's not increasing the yield for anything that we directly eat. If we were to judge our agriculture not by yield per acre, but by nutrition per acre, our agriculture would place far down in the world's agriculture. What they are trying to do around the world with Gates, who is a big supporter of Monsanto. Monsanto and Gates are very close. Gates actually invested over $27 million in Monsanto during the 2008 crash. They're trying to get the rest of the world to go to commodity agriculture, not food agriculture, because you make more money by selling your agriculture for commodities like corn, soy, and cotton for gasoline, and for animal factories and for processed foods than you by selling food. That would be a disaster, massively increase hunger if they were to follow our pattern and have this majority of their land in commodity versus food. Remember that distinction, almost nobody makes it. Commodity agriculture versus food agriculture. Food, nutrition should be what we're about, not Monsanto's bottom line and GMO commodity crops.
Yeah, this is a complicated thing. There's so many things to add. The big chemical companies like the ones you mentioned that are coming to my mind, Syngenta and Bayer, for example, companies based in Switzerland and Germany, creating agricultural chemicals that are not only banned in their own country, but they're banned across the entire continent of Europe, but they are happily selling to the United States where we happily use them. That's one thing to think about. The public health imperative in Europe is considerably stronger than it is here. They don't even allow them to use the chemicals that their own companies are making, which is, there's some very dark irony about that. So that's a part of it, that there is a certain level at which GMOs are simply a delivery system for the chemicals that predated the GMOs. GMOs just scales it up. In terms of whether they're using these seeds to feed the world, they're using them to feed, as we've heard the numbers, are 40% for ethanol, 40% for cheap hamburgers and cheap chicken nuggets. So they're putting calories in people's bodies. They just don't, they happen to be very calorie heavy and very low nutritional density. So they're making us fat, and they're creating all kinds of public health problems. They're putting calories in a lot of people's bodies, but not the kind of calories that we want. And the other thing is to remember the environmental rings that grow out of this. So when you see these companies having saturated their markets in North America, now they are pushing to create monoculture crops in places like Paraguay and Argentina and Brazil. And how are they doing that? They are mowing down rainforests to create more monoculture crops, to feed more monoculture livestock. And then they've got to try to convince these countries to eat the way Americans do. Now, there are a lot of problems with this. One are the public health issues, obviously. Like, we don't need more people in the world to eat the way Americans do, because Americans eat very poorly. The other thing is that a lot of countries have decided that eating a lot of meat is the way they can convince themselves that they've arrived in the modern era, because Americans eat a lot of meat, so now China wants to eat a lot of meat. This is a very bad idea. There's no way that the world can eat in the way that we do, either in terms of its public health or in terms of its land use. So unfortunately, the country that has created the most unsustainable food structures is also the one that is being pitched around the world, and other countries are trying to model their own systems after ours, which is really a bad idea. So there are a lot of problems associated with this one simple question.
Okay. Do GMO crops mean that we can use less pesticides to grow them?
Okay, you can, yeah. No.
Yeah, again, there's an element of comedy there, which is that why would chemical companies who survive solely on selling chemicals invent a technology that would mean less chemicals? That doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make any sense to their bottom line. Here's where the confusion lies. The vast majority, well over 90% of all GMO crops are either HT or BT. HT means herbicide tolerant. We described those briefly. That means that normally if you spray herbicide on your crops, it kills the crops, not just the weeds. They put a little piece of DNA from bacteria, actually, into your corn and your soy, and that means when you can aerial spray it, use a huge more amount of your herbicide, Roundup and others, the other companies make, and it doesn't kill the corn, kills the weeds, saturates the corn. You have huge more residues of these horrible chemicals in your food and in your kids' bodies, but it doesn't kill them outright. So that's herbicide tolerant, and that massively increases the use of herbicide and increases the bottom line. The other technology they put on the market is something called BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, and this is a bacteria that's a non-chemical insecticide, and that primarily went into corn, and this was their claim to altruism. The idea was, if we use a lot of this BT, that is going to kill the corn borer, let's say, and that way we'll have to use less of the harmful chemical insecticides. And indeed, that was true, actually, to give them their due, for the first year or two. But unfortunately, what was happening, and what is happening now, and is actually almost completely finished now, is that the insects that would eat the plant that had this Bt in every one of its cells would not eat enough to kill the insect. And by doing so, you were basically vaccinating the insect to not be able to be killed by the Bt and then its offspring. In other words, adaptation. And we know this same thing happened to the weeds. They're now super weeds. You can't kill them with Roundup. So this is third grade science, and they should have known it. And the real tragedy of that, as far as the Bt, is that Bt is a really important tool for organic farmers because it's a non-chemical insecticide. But now, because of the massive 24/7 use of this Bt in these GMO crops, insects have developed resistance all across the country to a number of different versions of this Bt bacteria. So it no longer actually is helping with reducing insecticides. It's actually, they're using Bt and all these other insecticides on top of it. This is even USDA data shows it. So with HT, the entire technology is based on using hundreds of millions of more pounds of Roundup, and now 2,4-D, which is an element of Agent Orange, and now dicamba, up to 1 billion more pounds in the next 5 to 6 years, unless we stop it through our lawsuits. And on the other side, their altruistic thing turned out to take away from organic farmers one of the few non-chemical insecticide alternatives they had, and now we're actually seeing once again a major increase in these insecticides. So that, sorry to be a little bit long-winded there, but that's the answer that I have to that question.
I want
And
to
I
add
would
to
just
that.
add to, sorry, I just want to add to what Andy just said, and I think that's, he's got very good points. And then I would actually add another lens to this question, because I just came from Iowa, actually, just like a week and a half ago. And what was interesting about Iowa, number one, is one of the centers of GMO production in Iowa. And one of the phenomenon that's happening because of repeated growing of monocultures is, which are encouraged by the commodity economy that Mckay just explained. Iowa, of course, one of the centers of the commodity economy, huge, vast fields of corn and soybeans sold into commodity markets. And one impact is the depletion of the nutrients that are in the soil. Most of that is GMO in Iowa. As a result of this repeated growth, you have the depletion of nutrients in the soil. What that means is that you need to have increasing quantities of chemical fertilizer that go into the soil in order to sustain these crops. And one major implication of this situation is that you have runoff of that of those nutrients, of nitrogen-based nutrients, that run off into the water supply. And guess what else happens in the water supply besides nourishing farms? People drink water. So the rivers, for example, the Des Moines River and the Raccoon River, where I was just a week and a half ago, frozen solid, incredibly stark and beautiful landscape of kind of tundra-like Iowa in the middle of January, frozen over all those corn and soybean fields. But meanwhile, from the ice drips, the steady drops of nitrogen that are actually entering into the water supplies of Des Moines and further cities further south, and ending up, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico in this big dead zone, which people have probably heard about. A lot, Iowa's number one or number two, depending on which year you're talking about, contributed to that dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So just further elaboration on this question is, as Andy described, the pesticide impacts, and two, the impacts of the fertilizers that are required in order to grow these kind of vast fields of
I think
GMOs.
I would like to add that Andy mentioned that there is a reduction initially of the insecticide use on the Bt crops. But that's only if you count the applied insecticide spray. There are insecticides produced inside the crop, the Bt toxin. And different crops produce different quantities of Bt toxin. And Charles Benbrook and others evaluated how much Bt was being produced per acre compared to how much insecticide was saved per acre. And it turns out there's far more insecticide in the BT crops than there is in the crops that are non-BT and sprayed. In one case, the amount of BT is as much as 12 times the amount that it replaces, that it reduces in terms of the spray. In addition, the BT is applied to the seeds that's produced in the crops to kill the corn rootworm. But it doesn't develop so quickly. And so the plant remains exposed for the first few weeks. And so one thing that they do is they coat the seeds in a time-released neonicotinoid insecticide. And that, if you add the neonicotinoids plus the BT, plus whatever they spray, it's certainly more than it displaces in the spray form. And the neonicotinoids are part of the package that causes colony collapse disorder. But also it is likely that glyphosate and Roundup are also major contributors to colony collapse disorder. Most people don't know that, but there's a lot of evidence now that it is a major component because the neonicotinoids do not explain the full colony collapse disorder symptoms.
There were a group of honest scientists, I'd say,
Where? Sorry.
who were contemplating methods of reducing the enormous amount of synthetic pesticides and herbicides. Of course, the simple answer is, go organic. But they were trying to figure out how they can do this in a highly industrialized setting. And one of the ideas was, if you could take these proteins that exist in certain plants that the insects don't like to be around, and they're called lectins. They're insecticidal proteins. And if you can somehow put them in a crop that you like, and if you can grow the crop with these lectins, then the insects won't want to go near them because, who knows, the smell of the protein, the taste of it, they'll just walk away. That was the concept. And a few, I thought, honest scientists said, well, maybe it'll work. And one of them actually tried it, and he put the lectins from a flower into the potato, and he tested it, and it resulted in very damaged rodents. And he published the paper, and he said he wouldn't eat these potatoes. Now, there is a tradition that has gone back for millennia on taking flowers and planting them next to your potatoes in different rows. So you create a very diverse planting regime. And if you know that the bugs don't like these lectins in these plants, then you plant them near the potatoes. And that has worked. That's called agroecology, using the natural systems. But again, the scientists thought they could somehow figure out an end run around nature by pulling the proteins out of the plants and trying to make a consumable product have all the properties that it takes many plants to have. Sort of like getting the perfect instrument that starts your car, does your email, does everything in one small little instrument. Usually it'll fail. So anyway, that hasn't worked. But there have been people trying to figure out how to reduce the enormous amount of pesticides that currently is being used in the world. And many of these pesticides and herbicides have not been adequately tested, and they are carcinogens or endocrine disruptors, but we're still using them. So, but this system that by putting it into the plants so far has not worked, and it's not likely to work.
So this pro-GMO movie ignored everything that was in your books and everything you said, and they focused on one thing, that they said that there was a crop of papayas in Hawaii that had failed, and then this person genetically modified the papaya and then planted that, and it worked out great. And the point of the movie was to say, why are you against genetically modified foods? Look, this person had a failed crop. We genetically modified this Hawaiian papaya, and now they saved the whole Hawaiian papaya crop. Anyone who's against GMOs is against these poor farmers who just want to have a nice papaya crop. And that was basically the point of the movie. They picked two crops, I think Hawaiian papaya and maybe a banana somewhere. So I guess the question is there, and a lot of people were impressed by that who watched the movie. So is that an accurate depiction of what's happening, that there are failing crops around the world? They're coming in, they're making a new genetically modified version that grows very well, sustains everyone, and has a lot of benefits. What's your comment on that movie and this general point that they made in it?
I think I'd like to start with that. So in my book, Food Fight, there are 3 chapters devoted to Hawaii, including a chapter about the papaya on the Big Island, and a chapter about Kauai, and a chapter about Maui. So the short answer to that question is the scientist who saved the papaya is in fact a world-famous guy because he performed this miracle. He was able to regenerate an entire papaya economy on the Big Island of Hawaii. He also happened to be a native of that island, and he really is considered by the papaya economy to be a local hero, and in that respect, justifiably so. And I think if you were to try to come up with a pro-GMO argument, he becomes a really useful story because in his own language, I spent quite a bit of time with him. He was doing publicly funded science, not science funded by Monsanto, in his words, to support local farmers to create their local food economy. On the island right next door, in Kauai, there was none of that going on. There are these secret experimental farms that are owned by companies like Monsanto and DuPont and Dow and Syngenta, where they are spraying in some cases, 4 entire crop rotations in a single calendar year because the climate is so good. And not telling anybody that lives on the island what they're spraying or in what quantities or what kinds of concentrations. And local people there forced local county ordinances to try to force these companies to tell them what they were spraying and how often and how much. And these companies refused to tell anybody anything about it. Finally, they passed a local law that was going to force these companies to reveal what they were using. And the companies challenged that in federal court, saying local people don't have control over their own land, that the local land is actually controlled by federal ordinance, and the companies won that case in federal court. So in Hawaii, you have examples of scientists that have become world-renowned, which we say the face of the so-called positive use of GMOs, and you have the islands where, I think as Sheldon said earlier, the 3 pillars of democracy, what did you say? The ability to vote, the ability to have a free press, and the ability to have free, unfettered science, all 3 were radically compromised, where you had democratic movements that were completely crushed by very big economic power, political power plays by these global corporations. So yes, the papaya plantation was saved by publicly funded genetic research, and right next door there were local democratic movements that were crushed by global conglomerates. So both are happening within just a few miles of each other, and it's worth remembering both of those.
Yeah, just to add to that, the Center for Food Safety, my organization, we have a Hawaii office in Honolulu, and I've been fighting GMOs in Hawaii for 12 years. We were the authors of the Kauai legislation that you're talking about, and I actually argued that case, defending both the Kauai, the Maui, and the Big Island bans and or moratoriums on GMOs. The court found, just to clarify, that the federal law, or FIFRA it's called, on insecticides and pesticides in general, is so weak that it did not preempt. Every one of those counties that said we have the right to legislate what pesticides, what GMOs in our county are allowed in our county were not preempted by the federal. We won that part of the case. They said, however, the state does preempt the counties. This is really important for activists out there. almost entirely at the state level, you can pretty much say no to any pesticide you want, and you can pretty much say no to any commercialized GMO. Any state in the union can do it tomorrow. And in numerous states where the counties are not preempted by the states, the counties can do it. So counties can do it, and counties have done it. Counties have gone non-GMO. You go pretty much half the whole coast of California. The counties have said, we don't want GMOs planted, and they've passed laws, and those laws are entirely legal. So for you activists out there, this is a really good thing you can do. You can go to your county, check whether it's preempted by the state or not, or we can help you at the Center for Food Safety if you want to contact us. And either at the state or county level, you can say no to any neonicotinoid, the bee-killing pesticide that Jeffrey was talking about, any other pesticide you think, endocrine disruptors, or any commercialized GMO. You are not preempted by the federal law at all. And that's really an important thing to remember. Hawaii is ground zero, as Mckay mentioned. It's ground zero for Monsanto and for many of the other companies. It's where it is their laboratory. That's when when Roundup doesn't work anymore, they do their cocktail mix of herbicides. You have trade winds there that can carry those for miles. They go into schools. They made school children sick. You have asthma at a absolutely epidemic level. You've got cancers. It is just a horrifying situation. They've turned Hawaii into a poison paradise. There's a wonderful documentary, a really accurate documentary called Poison Paradise with major scientists all the way through, which I recommend that you see immediately. It's a wonderful film, and it describes this horrifying, it really is using the entire population of many of these islands as guinea pigs for these cocktail of herbicides and not telling them what they're breathing, not telling what's going into their schools and their communities, and even suing to make sure that there's not buffer zones. All we wanted at some point was buffer zones in front of these schools and hospitals, and they sued to stop even buffer zones for these chemicals. One side story on the papaya thing, and there are certain GMOs that are very minor, like this one, that can do some decent good, but unfortunately, because of the overall problem with GMOs, Japan refused for many years the Hawaiian papayas. So ironically, by saving the papayas from this virus, it actually reduced the number of successful papaya farmers in Hawaii by a huge percentage until very recently Japan began to accept those papayas again. I would also note that one of the problems with any long-term technology to try and control, very much like our flu vaccines, last year it didn't work. Why? Because viruses are notorious for changing. So you may find a GMO that for a year or two may save a monoculture like those in Hawaii, but it will not work over a period of years because the viruses change, and you're never going to catch up with the viruses.
I'd like to say a few things about the papaya because it illustrates perhaps the nuance about the way the term GMOs is used. And I spent a lot of time studying the science behind the development of the papaya resistance to ring spot virus. And I went into it looking for controversy, scientific controversy, specifically about the health effects. And what I learned was that the methodology that's used to produce the ring spot resistant papaya is very different than the methodology used to produce BT crops and herbicide resistant crops. It turns out that plants, like mammals, they have a system to to resist organisms, viruses and bacteria. They have an immune system. And that's what this publicly funded research was designed to determine. How to activate the immune system of the plant to direct it against a particular virus that was decimating the plant. By activating its immune system, you don't put in a foreign protein that is designed to express itself to produce a protein in every part of the plant. It's specifically designed to activate the immune system of the plant to attack the virus so the virus can't destroy the plant. So if there's an area of biotechnology that has the least possibilities, from what I was able to read through all the literature, of causing any health effects. This is probably one. Now, I may be wrong because tomorrow somebody may come out with something, but so far there isn't any good scientific studies that indicates even a scenario of where this can affect human health, and yet it's been effective. It may not be effective next year. Absolutely, Andrew is correct. The viruses could, they could mutate, but even in the short run, it has been quite successful, and they might figure out a way, like they do with our vaccines, however good they are, they might figure out a way to tweak it if there's a new ring spot virus that overtakes it. So I think that this area of biotechnology is different than what they are using, and all the other methods that they try to use to get rid of the ring spot virus were all more dangerous to human health than the one that they are currently using.
So I want to bring up some points that haven't been made yet about the papaya, because I have some different information. I remember debating 2 of the 3 scientists that developed it with some other colleagues of mine, and at the end, one of the developers said, "You guys were good, too good. We should never have debated." They didn't have any of the research done for health. No, there was essentially no animal feeding studies, certainly no clinical trials, no evaluation of the massive mutations that occur as a result of the process of genetic engineering, where you can have hundreds or thousands of mutations, and research done on existing GMOs where they did evaluate the proteins and metabolites showed significant problems, including the increase of compounds that are related to cancer and allergies and other things. There's some anecdotal evidence of people getting sick after they switched from the natural papaya to the GMO papaya, but there's been no research. There's no human clinical trials. There's no post-marketing surveillance, so we have no idea if it in fact was the papaya. So I actually don't think that this is a success. I think it's a disaster, because there's so much of the process was unevaluated, and that the people there are just acting as the guinea pig. And because of the closing of the Japanese market and other markets, there was a contraction of 40% of the papaya market, even though there was an expansion of the papaya eating public in the United States. The price per kilo went from $1.29 down to 80 cents below the price of production. And a ring spot virus resistant variety has since been developed through conventional breeding. And even though it resisted the ring spot virus, it became more susceptible to the black spot fungus. And it cross-pollinated widely. They took 20,000 seeds. 50% were from organic farms, I think, or 80% were from organic farms, 20% were from gardens and outdoor varieties, and 50% of the seeds were genetically engineered, meaning that it had cross-pollinated into organic, into backyard, and into wild papaya. So it became, also the papaya was stolen out of their field trials and planted by farmers. So it became completely uncontrolled and potentially dangerous. And I would say that I remember being interviewed by the person who did that film. I haven't seen the film yet. And I'd been interviewed maybe 1,000 times, actually quite more than that. And I couldn't understand why he kept asking me questions that were irrelevant and unimportant and based on gossip. And it was the worst interview I had ever had. I figured this guy either is completely unprepared, has no idea what my work is about, or he's simply trying to discredit me. And it was the discredit. He was actually, it turns out, being paid by the industry to create a film designed to discredit those who were calling for more science, calling us anti-science, those of us who are calling for more science. So it was interesting to be on the receiving side of hours of questions. And I was like, I finally had to say, look, let me speak about what I know about. And none of that I understand was in the film.
Well, calling for more science is not the same as a disaster. I mean, we can call for more science. Many of the things that you cited have not been in the scientific literature. And they could be true, but my skepticism, I look for the scientific literature to validate, going through peer review, before I would make a claim that this is one of the most dangerous processes. I haven't found it, so maybe you have some evidence.
Let me give some science.
Maybe you have some
Let me
evidence.
give
but
some
not
science.
now.
Can I make a
Not
quick
now.
statement here? I don't want to fall into a trap here, which is the trap that they always have for us, which is that we all know that 97.5, whatever the most percent of GMOs is herbicide tolerant and BT. That's what we were talking about before. We know that what's being sprayed are probable carcinogens and other toxins. To concentrate on 0.0000001% of the use of this technology, as apparently this movie did, because I refused to be in this movie. They filmed me surreptitiously for a couple of minutes, but because I knew it was supported, as Jeffrey was saying, I think we're falling into their trap. Papaya, if you look at the amount of papaya that's genetically engineered versus corn, soy, it is so minuscule that let's stay with the program. If you take away, which we should, herbicide tolerant and BT crops, if we could erase those, we would be talking about such a tiny percentage of the world's agriculture and our agriculture that it would be laughable. You'd have the Botox apple, the apple that doesn't brown, I call it Botox, you don't know how old it is, and a little non-browning potato, a little bit of squash here, and a tiny bit of papaya there, which may or may not last for 3 or 4 years, depending on what happens to the virus. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this discussion wouldn't be here. That's their trick. They never mention HT, they never mention BT, they never mention all the things we talked about before papaya, and they concentrate on one little tiny example, and by that way they distract the entire conversation. So we may want to keep talking about this, but I think there may be more important questions that you have.
And I do want to respond just briefly with the science. There's more than 100 published studies on viral proteins, all these different categories of viral proteins. And it is possible that this papaya produces a viral protein as part of its mechanism.
Possible.
Yes, and it's also possible that it transfers into gut bacteria to be produced.
Possible.
Anyway, so
Anything's possible.
so because in the process of fighting the virus, they create a gene that often produces the protein and not just the RNA. The viral proteins are designed to help the virus take hold. So they often suppress the organism's resistance to viral infection. So if you're exposed to viral proteins, you may get colds more, you may get...
It has to be proven.
It's not just possible.
So, Sheldon, I'm happy to respond, but please don't interrupt because I'm happy to do that. Thank you. So, I was talking to Jonathan Latham, who's a virologist, who's very concerned about the papaya, the zucchini, and the yellow squash because they're all designed for creating potentially viral proteins as part of the package for creating this resistance. We do know that some do produce viral proteins. I just don't remember which one does. In addition, when you do a full proteomics analysis of all the proteins and the metabolomic analysis of the metabolites, that's where you found, and this is a published study, that putrescine and cadaverine were increased in Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn. That is linked to increased allergic reactions in cancer. Another study done by Zola and others showed that there was a new allergen that was now in Monsanto's BT corn. Now, how does that work? The gene was there in regular corn, but it was silenced in regular corn. In Monsanto's corn, it was switched on accidentally, and now it produces gamazine. So these are some of the background changes, which I talked about in my lecture, that there were 3 reasons why GMOs that we discussed, why GMOs could be dangerous, among others, and one is the process of genetic engineering itself. And there's dozens and dozens of incidences where the process is shown to be dangerous. And when you say, I don't think, Sheldon, it's up to us to prove it after it's out there and people are eating it. I think it's up to them to do the science to verify that it's safe before that it's fed to people. And because they're not doing the research, we can show clearly that by not doing the research, they are exposing us to very serious problems.
are the current pesticides used to grow GMOs becoming less effective over time? What is the significance of this? Are we on the verge of creating weeds that are resistant to the herbicides, which will require us to use even more and stronger pesticides?
Yeah, I think it's important to, I said this in my talk yesterday, it's important to understand, very similar to what we're facing with antibiotics right now, with resistance to antibiotics. We have these bugs that have gotten their resistance. The same thing is happening in our agriculture. The idea that these weeds would not adapt is, again, bizarrely unscientific, even though Monsanto in the late 90s said that weeds would not develop resistance to Roundup. They said that in congressional testimony, and of course it was ridiculous. I found that third grade science in Washington, D.C. teaches adaptation, so Monsanto wasn't even up to a third grade science level there. And of course, we now have in well over half the farms in the United States, we have these super weeds that are resistant to Roundup. And something like, pigweed, the consistency of baseball bats, and they grow so closely, you can't even knock them over with a combine. So we're not just at peak antibiotics, where we're really looking to the future saying we have to go to probiotics. We can no longer say the way to get rid of a bad bacteria is to kill all your bacteria. That was Neanderthal biology. And we now know probiotics. The real answer is to develop a really healthy bionomic biotic community in your body, and that's really going to be the answer. It's the same true with agriculture. We need to go to the probiotics of agriculture. We're at peak herbicides. Roundup was the only wide spectrum, in those days thought to be relatively non-toxic herbicide we have. There are no new Roundups. None. There's none in the pipeline. Zero. No one will tell you there is. Monsanto won't tell you there is. And so instead, now that Roundup is becoming useless in some areas because of these super weeds, they're going backwards. As I mentioned, they're going back to 2,4-D, which is an element of Agent Orange. They're going back to dicamba. They got rid of these older, more toxic herbicides because they thought Roundup was better. So we're at a chemical arms race going backwards to get rid of these super weeds. And of course, guess what? We already have a significant number of weeds that are tolerant, resistant to 2,4-D. We have a number of weeds that are resistant to dicamba. Eventually, just like the antibiotics problem, these weeds will be resistant to any chemical we can come up with. We thought that nature was no match for our chemical industry. Turns out our chemical industry is no match for nature. Nature bats last, and if you're a baseball fan, it bats 1,000. And so we're going to have to go to a completely new paradigm than this paradigm of extermination. It will not work with insects, it will not work with weeds, it will not work with fungi. This entire industrial model is been accelerated by the use of GMOs, which accelerates the use of these, but it was going to happen whether GMOs were there or not. That model of extermination, which happened, as Mckay was saying, after World War II, that model is over. Not because just of activists, it's because that's the way nature works. Adaptation will work, we will not be able to keep up with it. So we need agroecological methods that Shelley was talking about. We're going to, sooner or later, nature will win, and we better be there when it does, otherwise it's going to be for a very, very hard landing. And all the GMOs have done is massively accelerate the adaptation of these weeds, and eventually the insects, and eventually with our fungicides. We're also at peak fungicides, by the way, along with herbicides. So we're going to have to change our entire paradigm very soon to a whole new model of future of food and growing food.
I'd like to expand this conversation beyond just the production of food to the evolution of advertising and marketing, which has made all of us into suckers. When you think about the post-World War II advertising of lawn chemicals, so remember I mentioned the whole suburbanization of America, that included not just houses but lawns. And now what we've got 50 million acres of lawns or something like that in the United States. And what these chemical companies, they were not just selling to food companies or agricultural companies, they were selling them to homeowners because now we had all these lawns and they needed to sell us herbicides. So what was the great villain of the American lawn was clover. So clover happens to be a lovely little plant that is not hard on your feet, and they needed to convince American homeowners that clover was worth killing. So they came up with a really ingenious plan, and what they found, of course, is that clover is a major food source for bees. And bees, apparently, are the great nemesis of all little kids playing soccer in their backyard. So you can go back and look at advertisements from the 1960s, and these chemical companies are saying, do your kids get stung by bees? Well, the reason they get stung by bees is because you have clover in your yard, and we have a product that will kill all the clover. And they would sell you these herbicides that would kill all the clover, which of course would then eliminate food sources for bees. The problem that they didn't think about, or maybe they did, it's hard to tell how diabolical they were, but clover of course is a nitrogen fixer. So once you kill all the clover in your yard, now your soil in your yard is now nitrogen deficient. So the companies say, is your lawn nitrogen deficient? Well, we can sell you nitrogen fertilizer. So now instead of selling you 0 products, they're selling you 2, and killing all the bees to boot. So you have to take, this is where this environmental humanities component has to come in, because you have to look at the way all this stuff is fed to us, not just the food, but the actual mythology that has grown up and has made us all kind of robotic consumers of the products that they're trying to sell us. And you have to unpack a lot of things to choose wisely.
And just quickly, the language, and we mentioned this yesterday, the word pesticide should never be used, because it leads you to immediately think that these chemicals know what a pest is and know what a pest isn't. That whether it be Roundup or whether it be the neonicotinoids, they don't know what supposedly a good insect is or a bad insect is. So there's neonicotinoids that are supposed to deal with certain pests. They kill the bees. Well, are bees pests? No. They also kill birds, including quail in the area. Are they pests? No. They also kill caddisflies, which are a major source for fish in the rivers. Are they pests? No. We know that Roundup is a probable carcinogen, which means that it's probably causing cancer in children. Are children pests? No. Are grown-ups pests? Depending. I work in Washington, D.C., so you can see where there's some issues right now for me on that one. But mostly no. And so therefore, they're not. And Rachel Carson said this on the last page, and very important page of Silent Spring. Rachel Carson is one of my great heroes. If you've not read Rachel Carson, do so immediately. Silent Spring is a great place to start. And she said that we shouldn't call them pesticides. They are biocides. They kill living things. That is what they do. And to think that, again, that you can use these biocides in a way that doesn't kill so-called non-target organisms, that will not kill your butterflies and your bees and your birds and your kids, is ridiculous. That is what they do. And so let's stop using that mislabel. That's a very bad word, pesticides. They're biocides. So let's make sure we sort of get that into the language. Rachel Carson would be proud of us every time we use biocides instead of the wrong word, pesticides.
And let me, just want to, I'm sorry, I just thought I'd build on this idea that these gentlemen, Mckay and Andrew, have been talking about this kind of change in paradigm. I mean, this critique that you're laying out, first of all, is important to really grasp, because there needs to be kind of a change in orientation here. And secondly, to understand that this is not at the far edge of thinking. This kind of approach, a different way to approach agriculture, is firmly grounded in the sciences. And I just spent, as you guys I'm sure have, several years kind of immersed in the scientific journals about new ideas of agronomy and new ideas of growing food, which is clearly showing that a diversity of food sources, more organically rich material, is far more resilient to dramatic shifts in conditions, and that the industrial food system depletes the soil. Now, what's interesting is that some of the biggest institutions in the world have actually come to this very same conclusion. So just bring us back a little bit to 2008, which I know seems like ancient, a whole other epic from us. But basically, even before, let's say 3 years before 2008, which would have been 2005, there was a very heavy pressure campaign being put on the World Bank, which you're probably familiar as one of the big, huge financial institutions that has a huge influence on agricultural development strategies in developing countries. And the pressure was on asking the World Bank to really have a look at the effectiveness of the kind of industrial ag strategy that they'd been promoting. And it was led by some NGOs around. Food First is one of them, Friends of the Earth that some of you might be familiar with, a couple of these international NGOs. So finally the World Bank, to get them off their back, just to say, like, leave us alone, cool it, we'll commission a study. So the World Bank, the major, mainstream, huge institution, rounded up several dozens of millions of dollars, hired an incredible team of scientists led by a scientist who was working in Kenya at the time. He's an entomologist and one of the top kind of scientific institutions in the world. He hired a team of about 400 people in different parts of the world to actually analyze what impact industrial agriculture was having, and did it work? Were the new technologies improving yields? Were they improving access to food, which was one of the questions earlier about yields? And I'm compressing a long story about this. In 2008, the committee came out with this report, and the report was actually a scathing critique of the industrial agriculture system that the World Bank itself was funding, and which completely astonished the World Bank. It was the last thing they expected. It was actually an independent science study. The scientist himself, an independent person. I've talked to numerous people involved in the study. They're all deeply grounded in the scientific traditions. And the World Bank was astonished that this critique essentially said a number of things. Number one, that the export of these kind of modern agricultural technologies, including GMOs, was not increasing the yields of food. Number two, that actually the requirement for inputs to buying chemicals and other products were actually putting farmers into debt and actually worsening the conditions on farms. And three, that the kind of trade deals that were being cut to actually turn countries into commodity producers was actually undermining farmers' status on their land. So three very important critiques, deeply grounded. This hit like a stone wall in the Bush administration. George Bush was president at that time. It was the last year of George Bush's administration, George W. Bush. It was the last thing the Bush administration wanted to hear. The United States basically issued an official dissent to it, essentially saying that the scientists neglected to include some of the possible benefits of GMOs, and basically lobbied the world to withdraw its support for this study, which is what happened. So basically in 2008, as the world economy was going through its troubles, remember there was that back in 2008, this report was essentially withdrawn from public discussions, why you haven't heard of it before, and it's why, and yet this report was identifying many of the exact same things that we're talking about here at this table about the kind of flaws and vulnerabilities of industrial agriculture, affirmed by some of the top scientific minds when it comes to the agricultural sciences in the world. And so that report now informs a lot of people who are advocating reform of this system, but I just want to point out that the discussion we're having here is not drawn from the kind of, not that it ever would have been, all these people's work I have respected over the years, so this is not, I'm just saying any perception that this is somehow out of the mainstream of established scientific thinking and international institutions who are doing honest analysis of how this works is completely consistent.
Okay, so President Trump is basically against regulation in general. The head of the Environmental Protection Agency is a climate change denier named Scott Pruitt. There was some article, I didn't pay too much attention, that the person who was going to oversee what chemicals got approved or not was a woman who was from the chemical industry. I don't believe she got approved, but assume that based on the current atmosphere, where there's this general anti-regulation atmosphere, and a lot of people seem to support that, if the technology of GMO crops proceeds unchecked, will we see the contamination of the world's food supply, and what exactly would that mean?
We will not see the contamination of the world's food supply because to a great extent the world has rejected this technology intelligently. About 90% of all GMOs are grown in a couple countries in South America, Argentina, Brazil, the United States, and Canada. So the rest, imagine the rest of the world. If you look at worldwide, there's actually slightly more acreage in organic, both certified and non, than there is in GMOs. You can estimate it at 8%, 7% of the world's agriculture is GMO. Unfortunately, that is not true of our wonderful country. And Trump, most recently, in his Farm Bureau speech, said that he is devoting himself to the deregulation of biotechnology. That is going to be one of his major things. He said, "Aren't you happy you voted for me?" He said to this group of this was only about 2 weeks ago. So we know we have our work cut out for us. Yes, we're looking at, you know, continued contamination of our food supply through the biological pollution I talked about, through potentially the approval of insects and other animals. We talked about that earlier. But again, unless we're successful in halting the movement from herbicide-tolerant Roundup-ready corn, remember, this is 90% of our corn. It's 50+% of all of our cropland is in this corn, soy, and cotton that's genetically engineered. If they move, which they have to now because we know nature batted last there, from Roundup back to 2,4-D, back to dicamba, you know, and these are mainstream weed scientists have said this. Not only are we going to create many more and more of these super weeds, but think of 1 billion pounds of 2,4-D. Really, 1 billion pounds of dicamba, which Arkansas has already banned. A whole state's banned it. And that means that is this last squeezing out of this technology of Monsanto, who's going to be merging with Bayer, of Dow, who's merging with DuPont, Syngenta's merging with China. This is their last way to try and use this technology to squeeze, again, many, many billions of dollars of profit out of these old chemicals before we move to this new paradigm. But that will have a catastrophic effect on our rivers, on our air, on our soil, and on our aquifers, and on our health and the health of our children and communities. It has to be stopped. 2 ways you can do that. One is you can go, actually a number of ways. We mentioned you can have your county and state go non-GMO, so you at least won't have it there. Obviously, if you want to support people like the Center for Food Safety, my organization, and others, Earth Justice, and others who are working on this through our litigation, that's great. And for goodness sakes, in 2018, go out and vote, and make sure you vote for the right people, the people that are that are looking to a new future, and not the rapidly aging billionaire club there that simply wants to promote profits for the biotech companies.
I'd like to jump in here too. So I wrote a book with a guy who worked at the EPA for 25 years called Poison Spring. It's kind of a follow-up to Silent Spring. And I would like to, as much as I'd like not to take the heat off of Trump, it's worth remembering that these problems are way deeper than Trump, and they're way deeper than Republican politics. These issues of the revolving door between industry and government is as old as government, I suppose. It's just gotten scaled up with the size and power of corporations. You can go easily back into the Nixon administration to see the beginnings of all this. So let's not just blame this on Trump. This is a system that Citizens United ramped up when it uncorked the money that's flowing into politics from corporations. I do want to kind of add a side note to this and remind us why GMOs are so important and why the political and corporate energy is so strongly behind them. It's really worth remembering how many industries are built on top of GMOs. So it's not just Monsanto that wants GMOs to stick around. It's oil companies that want GMOs to stick around, or it's fuel companies that want them to stick around because they are supplying ethanol. It is McDonald's wants them to stick around because they are feeding the cows that go into the hamburgers. It's Purdue that wants them to stick around because they're creating the feed for the cheap chickens. It's Coca-Cola wants them to stick around because they're creating high fructose corn syrup. The entire food industry has been built on top of this technology. So when you wonder why it is that so many powerful forces are behind this one technology, it's because the entire system is built on top of it. It reminds me, I just finished writing a magazine piece about people trying to restore a mountaintop coal mining country down in West Virginia. And as I was doing my research, it struck me as interesting that one of the biggest industries that has supported the coal industry is the railroad industry. Now, that might seem far-fetched, but railroads make a very large percentage of their profits by moving coal around the country. So if coal goes away, then railroads lose their profits. So you have to you have to keep in mind who all the players are. It's not just the obvious ones. This economy is really tightly stitched, but also kind of invisible to most consumers. So in addition to voting right and supporting the right nonprofits, just not giving any of these players your money when you're eating is a useful thing. You can not buy Coke and fight GMOs just that way as well. So keep all that in mind.
Absolutely. We all have a moral obligation not to continue these disastrous food future. But actually, there's something very interesting with this, and Mckay is absolutely right. The 2,4-D crops and dicamba were approved in the last month of the Obama administration, as was the GE salmon we talked about. Obama was as bad on this issue as you can possibly imagine. It's just unfortunate that Trump we had no idea what his position was going to be, but we should have guessed. But actually something very interesting is happening, which is that because of the unique dangers of GMOs, actually most of those companies are not devoted to GMOs. Most of the food companies don't like the chemical companies trying to take over the food supply. So for example, the Grocery Manufacturers Association was the biggest opponent of GMO labeling. Biggest opponent. But a number of their members say, no, we want transparency and we want to go GMO free. So recently, 8 major companies, Unilever, which is behind Coke, Campbell's, Nestle's, Mars, Tyson's Foods, Dean's Food have all left the Grocery Manufacturers Association and saying they support GMO labeling, mandatory GMO labeling. The GMA was so scared because it was losing its fees. It's a trade group. It survives on fees. Nestle's was their #1 fee. Nestle's is gone. They got so scared that, and this is really important, this is going to be the year of GMO labeling, right? After the federal law was passed, in the next few months, every one of us is going to be commenting to the USDA saying we want great labeling because it's required by law. The Grocery Manufacturers Association actually sent in comments to the USDA supporting mandatory GMO labeling. They had spent over $110 million fighting GMO labeling in California, in Washington, in Oregon, in Vermont. We were against them in a number of suits, and now they're moving because it's not worth it. Now, on one level, it's not great because they say, we'll take the corn and soy whether it's GMO or not. On another level, it's great because it will stop this very dangerous technology. And why will labeling stop this technology? Why has labeling stopped this technology wherever there is labeling? Because this technology has completely failed the market test. It offers no advantages, no lower cost, no better taste, no more nutrition, nothing to the consumer, or to the public, I should say. Offers nothing except more risk. The risk that Jeffrey's talking about, the environmental risk that we're talking about, more herbicide residue on your food. So why would a rational member of the public walk into a store knowing that it's mandatory labeling, say, why would I buy the GMO? It offers me nothing but risk, no advantages whatsoever. That is why they spent $100+ million stopping labeling up to this point. That's why they're doing it, because they know they will fail the market test. They will fail it dead to rights, right? So when we get labeling, and we will get labeling with all of our help, we did pass a law, it's a flawed law, but right now it looks like without the opposition of GMA, we will get labeling. When we get labeling, it will be the end of 90+% of all GMOs in this country, as it is in Europe. This will be the year, guys. This will be the year we'll win or lose that battle right now, next couple of months. The proposed labeling regulations will come out probably in the next, could be tomorrow, but it'll certainly be the next 2 months, because they've got to get it finished by statute July 2018. They have to get mandatory labeling requirements finished by July 2018. That's our deadline to make sure they're the right kind of regulations, and if they are, it will be a death blow to a huge amount of GMOs in the United States of America.
If Andrew's strategy is correct, it'll be quite remarkable and probably unprecedented in this country. I've discovered that it takes, once a product is put on the market, chemical product especially, takes between 25 and 50 years to get rid of it. 25 to 50 years. I'm talking about asbestos, PCBs, and a few other chemicals that have been banned. We have about 85,000 chemicals that are in the industrial system. Very few of them have been fully assessed for their risk. And in 40 years under TSCA, over many different administrations, only 5 of them have been banned. PCBs is another one. But it took 25 to 50 years to do it. So it's an enormous effort once these products are on the market. Now, there was one great exception, but you can't repeat it very often, and that was the chemical Alar. Some of you are old enough to remember that in the 1980s. But the NRDC put out a study that was not published that said that children are going to get cancer, 5,000 more a year, because the apples were sprayed with Alar. And it wasn't even a pesticide, it was a growth promoter, so that they could be picked all at the same time. And 60 Minutes told the story. And within days, all the consumers stopped buying apples and apple juice. Completely. It was a consumer-driven move. And within weeks, the manufacturers stopped making the product, Alar, diminazide. And I remember speaking to 1,000 people at the Washington Press Club. Many of them were farmers. And I said, you know, you folks, you do a lot of studies of the proper color of your tomatoes and the proper color of the apples that the consumer would buy. Why don't you do a focus group study and tell the focus groups that you have a substance that you spray on the apples so that they can be picked by one group of migrant farmers at one time, and that causes cancer in animals, and see what they have to say. And maybe you wouldn't have gone through this mess. And of course, they couldn't believe I could even raise that question. But that's the point, to test the thing before it goes on the market. Spend 25 years getting the definitive study of whether or not it is hazardous, not 25 years once it's on the market trying to figure out that it's unsafe.
Beautiful point. I want to add something to that. I love your point about the consumer-driven rejection. That's been the focus of our nonprofit Institute for Responsible Technology, which you can also support in addition to Center for Food Safety. We see the GMO issue in a very similar way, but also in different lenses. And it's an interesting thing where even in the labeling situation, we're both very much in favor of strong mandatory labeling. But I also want to point out that the voluntary non-GMO label is driving dramatic change right now. It's like some years ago, the milk products that said no RBGH or RBST or no artificial hormones, they sold at a higher price. They were driving a lot more consumers. The other ones realized they were losing money. It was not entirely eliminated, but it was kicked out of most American dairies, and there was never mandatory labeling. We see now more than 50% of Americans are concerned about the health dangers, and there's a dramatic push towards buying things that say non-GMO, such that, as we said before, Nestle's advertises on television that its coffee creamer is non-GMO. So if we don't get robust, strong, mandatory labeling, I still think we will win, and we are winning, and the tipping point is underway. But it'll be based on the voluntary labeling, where someone doesn't want a competitor on the same shelf saying non-GMO, and its product is exposed because it doesn't say that. So I think that it will accelerate the tipping point that's already happening. It will make it much quicker. Companies will start getting rid of it quicker. But even then, we still have to educate consumers about the health dangers, because there are countries in the world where there is mandatory labeling of GMOs. Products are on the shelf that say contain GMOs, and they're still selling. And they haven't gotten the pressure to remove it. I've taken pictures of it around the world. It's not certainly in Europe. In Europe, the consumers are aware enough so that there's hardly a single product, just a handful of products that say GMO. So I just wanted to give that other perspective, that the part of the lenses that we see differently is Andy works in Washington, he's involved in litigation and policy, and I'm like, I lived in the Midwest, now in California, is far away from Washington, and try and deal with things on a more general public level.
Just to say that I'm actually president of Humane Farm Animal Care that does certified humane, and I also have spent my life in working in creating the organic standards. So I have an enormous respect for market pressure, and I've worked on that as much as I've worked on litigation, and I totally support this idea. The Non-GMO Project has done a phenomenal job, and it's very important to look for that non-GMO sticker. The only issue with that is that it puts the burden on the wrong people. It puts the burden on producers who haven't changed what they're doing. They've got to test and say that they're non-GMO. Meanwhile, the producers that are doing the GMOs don't have to do anything.
Right.
That's not fair. That's just wrong. So people can still label non-GMO if they want, that's great, but we should put the burden on the people that have put these products in the marketplace to be forced to label in a mandatory fashion that their product contains these GMOs. That puts the burden on the right people. It doesn't mean that somebody out there who's had a dairy farm that's never gone into this has to take the time, effort, and labeling to label themselves as non-GMO to be protected from the market reaction. So it's much fairer. On the other hand, any kind of market pressure works together with legislation and policy. You need all those things working together. It's not either or, it's all of it together if we're going to win. As we've seen with organic, as we saw with BGH, which is a great example, that included litigation, included a federal circuit court lawsuit when Monsanto said it was unconstitutional to have not derived from BGH on the label. They said it violated their free speech rights for producers to say non-BGH. And they lost. We were in that case. They lost in the Fifth Circuit, and that's when they sold their product, when they realized that it could be labeled. And so that was a good combination of market with litigation. So
High five.
we
High
need
five,
all,
Andy.
Exactly. As always with Jeffrey, we need all of these tools if we're going to win this
Absolutely.
difficult battle. And I think it's a little apples and oranges, Shelley, with chemicals. So here's what I would say. After we win the GMO labeling battle, and we will win that battle, let's go for pesticide labeling. Because the reason these things have not been gotten rid of is because you don't know there's 55 different pesticides on your apple now, not including ALAR, and that 17 of them are potential carcinogens. If you were to walk into your supermarket and there were the apples, and instead of organic conventional, it said extremely contaminated, and then another one said mildly contaminated, and the third one said mostly not contaminated, otherwise known as organic, which would you buy? There's nothing conventional, that word, about having highly contaminated fruit you're feeding your children. I mean, Henry Higgins was a conventional man in My Fair Lady. It has nothing to do with carcinogens on your apple. So let's get the language right, and after we get your right to know with GMOs, let's get your right to know with these carcinogenic and these toxic pesticides in your food. That's the next battle. And it can be a market battle as well as a policy battle. It'll have to be a market battle.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I just jump in real quick? So in another chapter in Food Fight, I spent a lot of time out in Kansas talking to a guy named Wes Jackson, who's quite a well-known agricultural researcher. Also speaks like an evangelical preacher about these kinds of things. Some of you guys may have spoken to him. He thinks that the whole GMO thing, his word is it's a distraction. Like once the GMO thing is over, one way or another, we have to get back to the real problems, which is the structural problems of monoculture agricultural generally. And he actually thinks that we've made a 10,000-year deal with the devil on monoculture annual crops. So his theory, and he's working on this now, I think someday somebody out at his research institution is going to win a Nobel Prize for this, is what he calls perennial polyculture. So creating agricultural systems that are built on prairie ecosystems with many kinds of diverse plants all working together using agroecology principles to defend themselves against bugs and to preserve fresh water so they don't have to be irrigated so much. So that this problem that we're talking about is very acute and very loud about GMOs. But if GMOs didn't exist, we would still have legions of problems that are dictated by eating the way we do and having scaled up the way we do. So let's win this thing, but let's also not forget that the real battle is deeper and longer than just getting rid of GMOs. I'd be curious if you all agree with that. I feel like it's been an awful lot of noise about GMOs, but the problems are deeper and farther afield.
Absolutely. And this is, I feel guilty about this one, Mckay, which is that, and Michael Pollan sent me a poll that said that the label people respect most in the United States is natural. The second is non-GMO, and the third is organic. Well, we all know natural means absolutely nothing. There's no definition of natural at all. When Twinkies are natural, we obviously have an issue. Non-GMO is very important because, and I think when you look at some of the things that I've been saying and everyone here has been saying about biological pollution, how this kind of pollution can have, I don't think it's a lot of noise over nothing. I think it's a unique kind of pollution, Mckay, that is absolutely different from chemical pollution, and it would contaminate West Jackson's perennial agriculture just like it would anything else. Having said that, when you buy non-GMO, corn, let's say, tacos or whatever, that, or corn chips, that still has atrazine in it. That still has neonicotinoids. That still has a whole plethora of chemicals that are not used in GMOs. So you want to buy organic, preferable to non-GMO. It's going to, for your kids and yourselves, because non-GMO still allows for a huge number of very toxic chemicals to be used. All it's saying is that the GMOs were not used, and the chemicals used for GMOs, which are primarily these herbicides that we were talking about, have not been used. All those insecticides and fungicides, which are not allowed in organic, are allowed in non-GMO. So the way that pyramid should go is natural should not even be considered a label. It should be considered something for a comedy sketch, one. Non-GMO is important to get rid of some of these things we're talking about if you have no other alternative, but certainly the very most important would be organic, by far.
And I would also build on this a little bit and also just address kind of Mckay's question about what GMOs tell us about the kind of larger question that we face. And it was very striking. I just completed just a couple of weeks ago this book called Seeds of Resistance, which will be out in June. So keep an eye out. In the process, I did a lot of reporting and visiting places where they grow food. Here's what I asked the Monsanto representative who I was able to talk to. And I asked them about how they would characterize the kind of broad approach of Monsanto to agriculture. And her response was very interesting. It was basically, and my book is about seeds. It starts with the seed. You start with the seeds that you grow, and everything follows from the seed, basically. And she said that we endeavored to separate the seed from the environment in which it grows. And I thought that was an amazing response, extremely descriptive, and a very cogent and concise description of the industrial agriculture model. And if you look at the where that idea came from, it actually evolved very much along that. I liked what your description, Mckay, of this kind of notion of how the highway system contributed to the suburbs, which contributed to the move away of people from their sources of food. And so if we look at basically this period of time that actually starts in the 60s with the highway movement, which I hadn't thought of that connection, but it's interesting to think through. And suddenly, it's not a coincidence that basically the emergence of heavy chemical use on agriculture basically coincides, as Rachel Carson so beautifully described, basically coincides perfectly with the period in which we began to distance ourselves from our food. This is basically the big picture corollary. So in a way, what people have been doing, and just going across, and I think all of us in addressing this in one way or another, is people are trying to recapture that connection somehow in places, in groups like this, in groups all across this country and around the world. People are trying to bring back the seeds that evolved in their particular locales, are trying to maintain that connection of the seed to their food. And also just to add another element into this mix, is that climate change is altering the conditions for growing food. So whatever we're talking about, GMOs, other seeds, the conditions for growing food are being profoundly altered by the climatic shifts. So all around the world in food growing areas, it's just like it is here in Long Island, it's getting hotter, and the water is falling in more erratic patterns, and there are more extreme events. As you know here, with Hurricane Sandy, and many other versions of that have been occurring all around the world. So what does that mean for agriculture? That puts unprecedented stresses on this kind of industrial agriculture system. And now is the time when we need to be devising alternatives to that way of growing food. And increasing studies have been published in the scientific literature all over, as well as farmers' experiences are telling us more and more that agriculture that relies on a diverse sources of seeds, that rely on rich organic material in the soil, are far more resilient to these changes that are already upon us than the kind of industrial monoculture cropping. And so just to put the kind of GMO situation in this kind of larger context, I think there are very important movements and actually a consciousness that is actually beginning to creep into the public sphere, of which the kind of lobbying, labeling question is a symptom.
If we're answering your question here as a panel, thank you for asking a question about GMOs in the context of the other problems. I was brought into, in my mind, I chose to be involved in this issue because of the hugeness and the irreversibility of the GMO issue. I was not an environmental activist or a health activist or an activist, really. I had the tendency, I was more of a strategic communicator wanting to do good, and all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, this thing could change everything for everyone for all time, and no one knows about it, and and I didn't see a strategy that was out there to create a resistance movement. And if it weren't GMOs, if it were just the pesticides, if it were just the structure of agriculture, I might not have been motivated to get involved, but this was like, it was the pivotal point. Are we going to allow nature to be replaced? And that is a forever equation. So I treated it like a triage. In the triage, people use the term, but let me explain for those that don't know what it actually means. In the military hospitals, there was the group that came to the hospital that's going to live no matter what. There's the group that's going to die no matter what, and there's the group that'll live or die based on what you put your attention on. And the GMO issue was, to me, the triage, the bleeding patient that needed the bandage right now, because if we didn't, then it wasn't reversible. So, of course, and that's been why the Institute for Responsible Technology has been so unifocused on GMOs, because we wanted to give all the strategy and evidence and whatnot for behavior change messaging so that we would drive market forces. Now, what's interesting is two things. That Roundup, it turns out, which we've portrayed accurately as a huge culprit for health, turns out to be sprayed on wheat, barley, rye, rice, oats, potatoes, sweet potatoes, sunflowers, kiwis, all these non-GMO crops. So after creating all this anti-Roundup, appropriate anti-Roundup sentiment among the anti-GMO consumers, it becomes an easy stepping stone to say, and it's really important to eat organic and only non-GMO as a second choice. So that's our shift, is we're very strong now on organic as primary, and we use the Roundup to support that, and the film Secret Ingredients coming out this year uses that very strongly, and I think will convince more people to go to organic, millions than have been done before. And the other piece is that the tipping point in the United States has occurred, has started. It hasn't finished, it has started, where there's this race to be non-GMO by the food companies. And so we can afford to put our attention on the benefits of organic and the non-synthetic chemicals status of that. But in other countries which don't yet have the tipping point, we're raising money now to export the successful tipping point behavior change messaging model that we used here and that others have used here to the key countries around the world, so that they too can end up with a tipping point initiated, which will ultimately support organic, because once we eliminate the GMOs, it also protects the organic oasis, because GMOs are not allowed in organic either. So I just wanted to give you that perspective it's more of an activist perspective and an approach perspective rather than, the philosophical thing about GMOs in the context.
I just want to, I want to support what Jeffrey just said, because it was certainly, and I want to share this. When I was growing up in New York, in areas, and we worked on a dairy farm up in upstate New York, it was clear that we couldn't keep using these biocides. It was clear that a number of the technologies that we were using simply did not comport with life systems. That you use too much of them, and you'd be destroying your crops. You'd be destroying virtually everything. This is true with non-agriculture as well. So we thought it was called the appropriate technology movement. We said we got to devolve our technologies so that they fit with life systems. It's a huge movement, and the environmental movement was based in it. What I had not foreseen was that there would be a counter movement, and a very strong counter movement, that said we're not going to change technology so it fits with life. We are going to change life so it fits with technology. And so we are not going to change our factory farm system, and in fact, not even farms, our factories, animal factory system. We're going to genetically engineer animals so they either don't feel pain, or we'll genetically engineer chickens so they don't have legs, so they don't feel like they have to move. But the idea wasn't to get rid of this horrifying system that doesn't let animals have their natural movement, but to change animals so they would fit the factory system. The idea was we can't keep spraying all these herbicides that are killing the crops. Well, why don't we then genetically engineer crops so they can fit our need to sell ever more herbicides? This is a really terrible paradigm. It's a very important paradigm. This is their mindset. And that is what makes genetic engineering extremely important, because behind it is a very pathological mindset that somehow this technological industrial system can survive. We can actually, don't worry about climate change, because we can have plants that will grow in deserts. And this is the ridiculous Monsanto failure to have drought-resistant plants. So it's not whether they succeed or not. It's the imagination that they're sharing with the public every day in the front page of various newspapers and their propaganda. That don't worry, we're okay, because we're going to change all life systems so they fit this dysfunctional technological industrial system. We won't change the system, right, to fit. So that is really critical about organic, because organic says no to chemicals, it says no to irradiation, it says no to biological technologies. Those are the three great technologies of the last century. And it says that's progress, because we need to make our food system better fit with living systems. That's the reverse idea, okay? And that's the idea we want. So the paradigm here should not just be ignored. It is, in that sense, a replacement of nature that Jeffrey was talking about, and it's a very serious paradigm, and it's been inculcated in a lot of minds, especially of young people, having to do with this idea that we can make life completely fit with the technology instead of technology fit with life systems.
Right, so once again we come back to environmental humanities questions, because I think that's a 500-year-old Cartesian issue. Like, this is the idea that nature is some kind of machine that we can figure out and tinker with it to make it fit our own, in this case we're talking about like a capitalist system. Thankfully, we don't have to invent alternatives. The alternatives have been invented for thousands of years. In my courses, we often read indigenous or Native American philosophies of interacting with the natural world. I happened just this morning to teach courses on Taoism, the Chinese philosophy that says such audacious things as the very best way for you to behave is to act like water. Taoism, as an old 2,500-year-old tradition, knew long ago, long before GMOs or anything else, that the very best way to function was to fit yourself into the systems that already exist. These much larger, much more subtle, much more intricate systems. We don't have to invent stuff, we just have to remember it. And this idea that there's only one way to think about things, which is a European, capitalist, industrial, scientific, reductionist way of thinking about things, has been precisely what's led us down this path. And it's worth keeping our eyes open to these other traditions. They're not complicated and they're not hard to find. They're just, they've been forgotten. So those are out there and worth looking into.
Actually, I would just build on a little bit of what Mckay just said. What was very interesting is to realize how much, it's a little late in the process, but if you go down to the Southwest now, which has been experiencing extreme stress on the kind of food system, the agricultural system in Arizona, New Mexico, and other parts of the country, there's been a rejuvenated interest in Native American thinking about how to actually, which should not be that much of a surprise, but because we've kind of marginalized Native people so extremely in this country, that it now comes as this kind of stunning realization to remember that they have been growing food over thousands of years in this country, and the same thing exists in other countries. And so there's this kind of new attention to kind of native approaches to growing food because they've gone through thousands of years of ebbs and flows, and embedded in the seeds that they grow are even the adaptive capacities to deal with some of these changes.
Yeah, and I was just there for for almost 3 weeks, and they have another thing which is really interesting, which is this is where they live.
Yes.
They don't get
That's
to move.
Right. Yes, right.
They don't say, hey, you know, I'm kind of had it with Melville, New York. I'm heading over to Indiana. No, this is their land, and some of it's not very good land because of the genocide of the Native Americans with the land they ended up on. But they know they have to make this work. And it's
Yes.
kind of an interesting dynamic, you know, Mark, that they say,
Yes,
hey, we got to
that's
make
true.
this work.
There's no alternative.
We can't just
Right.
pollute this land like some animal factory, get rid of our aquifer, and then, oh, that's okay, I'm Monsanto, I can move to another state. This is not the night of the one-night stand thing, right? This is, they got to live there. I thought,
Very good
somehow
point.
I had
Yes,
not thought of that until I was down there.
Yeah.
I want to add about the indigenous cultures. I remember listening to a lecture on Ayurveda, and the doctor said that the way that the herbs work is that the human being is structured by certain laws of nature that are in particular sequences, and there's all the laws of nature in humans. But the herbs have specific laws of nature, here, scattered around the system. And when you take them, they're in your body, there's a resonance. So let's say you have a problem with your ear. He said if the same laws of nature that structure your ear are in that particular herb, if you have a problem with your ear, it's because the sequence is somehow corrupted. But the proper sequence is in the herbs, and you take it, and then there's a reverberation, there's a synchrony effect that happens. And the resonance from the proper sequence resets the sequence in the ear, and that's how the herbs work. And so this was an interesting concept from thousands of year old Ayurvedic health, which is based in India. When you look at the structure of the DNA and the RNA, all that, you have a sequence. And you think, well, how is it that food might have this intelligence, this sequence of laws of nature that might create a resonance or reverberation or restructuring? And more recently, after I heard this, I learned that the food contains RNA sequences which help create gene expression. So we all know about vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals, but we're missing this huge boat of the fact that there is some intelligence in food that actually structures and regulates our DNA. And I found it fascinating that hearing from the Ayurvedic perspective that food is intelligence and has a sequence that we can then reset our health, and then to hear modern science just discovering something which could be the same thing. It could be what they were talking about. So it's a very interesting, I have a natural, profound respect for the indigenous cultures and what they say, and I'm always looking for modern science to validate and verify, but it's the other way. It's sort of like you look at modern science and you're supposed to look at the indigenous world and say, is this true? Because they had somehow known the truth. Okay.
Okay, so there's a number of topics that we're not going to be able to talk about, but I would like to touch on them. So I guess one person answer it with just a 3-minute answer, because I want people to hear a few terms that you've mentioned before, and I don't even know if they've ever heard it. So I'm going to try to get through them. So really, let's avoid a discussion, although I'd love to have it, just so people hear these things that might not have been heard. So I'm going to ask about 10 more questions, 3 minutes each.
Hello? Please, hello? Can't hear you.
I'll use the mic.
So we can do that, but I think we're really enjoying this discussion. I have to say, I really respect everyone on this panel so much, and I'm gaining so much. And to hear the comments back and forth, it's very exciting for me.
Good. Okay, so I want to, so the first question then is, to date, do any GMOs on the market deliver consistently and significantly higher intrinsic yields than the natural crop from which they were derived? How does this compare to natural breeding?
I think there's a really simple answer. Is you just go to the National Academy of Sciences report. They came out about a year and a half ago. They asked this exact question. Esteemed top scientists from all over the country. They conclude, and Sheldon can add to this if you are inclined, and one of their conclusions, there were a whole range of conclusions, but one of them was that there was no apparent difference between the yields from GMOs and the yields that were otherwise occurring across the spectrum in American agriculture. So essentially, yields have been increasing over the past 40 or 50 years, but the National Academy found no particular contribution of GMOs to those yield increases.
Yeah, the New York Times did a front page story. Danny Hakim, you can look it up, Google it up on that satanic machine, and it'll tell you Danny Hakim, Hakim. The New York Times did a study of the European production. They don't use GMOs versus U.S. production. They found that European production was superior. You can also get Consumers Union's wonderful study called A Failure to Yield, which I think kind of is a spoiler alert there for what it says. I don't think any credible scientist at this point can say it increases yield.
What do you think of this statement made by the biotech proponents that millions of people in the U.S. have been eating GM food for a decade and no one has gotten sick?
You can take that up, John.
I think that's your baby. I'll take that one. Actually, we think that millions of people are getting sick because of GMOs and Roundup, and with thousands of doctors now prescribing non-GMO diets and seeing consistent and dramatic improvements. It's a question of don't look, don't tell. There's been no human clinical trials, no post-marketing surveillance. And they have a machine set up of attacking any adverse finding. Now, if it's a drug, you're allowed to have an adverse finding. You're allowed to have a side effect. But you're not allowed to have a side effect if you're food. And so there's a theory, the concept, the political concept, is that there's no difference. And that came from, when it was approved, the person in charge of policy at the FDA was Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president, and there was a concept of substantial equivalence. When you look at the actual memos of the scientists at the FDA, they said GMOs were different and led to different risks, including allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and should be studied. But the White House gave orders to the FDA to promote GMOs, so the commissioner proudly in one of the memos said, this policy basically is accord with your instructions. But when it was reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget and by the Health and Human Services, as it went up the political ladder, they said, we have to take out these 12 pages about the environment. We have to make sure that it indicates that it's not different than GMOs. We should make sure it's clean. As it went up the political ladder, it got safer and safer. And so the official political position in the United States is there's no difference. And on that basis, it's allowed to be considered, no safety testing, et cetera. But if they find one problem, it could knock the house of cards down. So they have a echo chamber of fake organizations, so-called scientists, bought media, et cetera, so that if there's any problem that's raised, they attack the scientists, they attack the finding, they come up with talking points, and within 24 hours, they're circulated all around. So this is one of the most unscientific things that they ever say is this sentence, that millions of people are eating it and there's no problem, trillions of meals. It's one of the most under-supported statements by science because they're putting their blinders on, they're looking at what they want to look at, and they're not looking at actual impacts.
And they know that these herbicide and these toxic biocide residues do create harm. What they're saying is that the genetic manipulation in and of itself, not the fact that these have these residues on it, and the EPA has keep rising these residues. So all that, we used to have very small residues allowed for Roundup. Now you have huge residues allowed for Roundup, and 2,4-D, and dicamba. We know those cause illness, peer-reviewed studies all over the place. We now know that there's no consensus whatsoever. As Jeffrey was saying, the genetic manipulations themselves, they're not well known. They're not well characterized in many cases, and they themselves can have a lot of health issues that we haven't even found out yet, because the government's not looking, the corporations aren't looking. So you have a very few independent scientists who somehow get enough money to look, and then whenever they actually find something, that's shot down. But the government isn't looking, and the corporations aren't looking. So these very courageous independent scientists, the only people looking to answer this question as far as the genetic manipulations, we know it's answered as far as the biocides, but as far as this aspect of the danger, and they're attacked when they come out. So that shows you how fixed the game is.
How many peer-reviewed studies have there been on the safety of GM crops on animals, and how many on humans? How is the quality of studies that have been done?
I remember talking to Dr. Arpad Pustai about 8-9 years ago, and he discounted the industry research as basically industrial research that had nothing to do with human food safety. He said basically there was maybe at that time 25 academic research studies. The industry puts out a list of 1,700 here, and that's been looked at by scientists like Judy Carman and others that basically eliminate almost all of them as entirely irrelevant. You know, the size of the breast of the chicken has nothing to do with human health. So I actually don't know the number, because it's a question of what criteria you establish, whether it's considered an academically acceptable peer-reviewed study. But even the peer-reviewed study, for example, that Monsanto put out in 1996 in the journal Nutrition, according to Dr. Pustai, was way below the normal requirements needed for publication in that journal. And they didn't do some basic stuff. It left out a lot of information, in fact, that was discovered later showing vast differences that they had denied. And it turns out they paid for its publication. They paid a page fee for its publication. So it's hard to know. And then, of course, Monsanto will ghostwrite certain articles. These articles came out, this fantastic, over 1 million documents from Monsanto are now public, and they've been going through, the lawyers have been going through it. And we find out that when the IARC was being prepared, the committee that was going to determine that Roundup was carcinogen, they prepared this entire anti-IARC program, and one was to ghostwrite studies. And one person was giving his yearly review of what he did, and Monsanto had said, yep, Ghost wrote this. And they're claiming they don't ghostwrite. So it's hard to know, if something is actually a real study or one of those Monsanto fake studies.
And Shelley, your expertise is conflict of interest. You might want to chime in here. One of your expertise.
Well, first of all, I've found about 30 studies in the scientific literature and peer-reviewed literature, animal studies, that showed adverse effects. I first found 26, and then some added ones just came out. For example, they did a study on rats, and they found that in their study of the rats that were fed the GMO, that they had abnormalities in the gut of the rat, and there's the study. It wasn't reported in the press. It wasn't discussed. Nobody made any mention of it. That's because it didn't appear in one of the 6 leading medical journals in the country. Usually, if you want to get press, you put it into the New England Journal of Medicine or whatever. But there's no human studies. We're all part of the human study, but nobody is there's no human studies in peer-reviewed literature. They'd have to take human beings and give them GMOs, and I don't know. They'd have to look for something. So there's been no studies like that. In terms of conflicts of interest, it's endemic in this whole business. Fortunately, a number of the respected journals require the scientists to declare their conflicts of interest. So whenever I see a study, I always look for that declaration, and when I find out it's funded by Monsanto or any of the other companies, I really disregard it. because I don't trust any of those studies. So that's something to look for whenever you hear about a study. If it's in a journal that requires disclosure, then they're supposed to tell you where their money is coming from.
Are there differences in the nutritional profile of GMO crops versus the same crops grown conventionally?
I saw a analysis of corn that was grown in adjacent fields, and the amount of nutrients in the GMO corn was a fraction of the non-GMO corn. So it was not a published study. I did talk to the people who did it and how it was compared side by side. It's not, when you look at the 1996 article that I mentioned about the soy, Monsanto said that in the title that their genetically modified soy is substantially equivalent to non-GMO soy. And even though they said that, there was a 27% increase in trypsin inhibitor in their soy, and also changes in the fat content, and well, there's changes in other things, in fat content of milk of animals that ate the soy, etc. Then Barbara Keeler, a medical writer, found in the journal, in the archives, the only side-by-side comparison of the GM versus the non-GM. They had actually rigged their research by creating a lot of statistical noise to making it hard to determine, but there was side-by-side evidence that they didn't publish. And she found that the trypsin inhibitor in the cooked soy was as much as 7 times higher in the GM soy compared to the non-GM soy, which could cause allergic reactions and all sorts of digestive problems. There was an increase of about double in terms of an anti-nutrient, and there was a reduction in protein, a bunch of changes. And this is part of the unpredicted side effects as a result of the genetic engineering process. But then you add to that 2 things. You add the spraying of Roundup, and Roundup grabs onto the minerals. And I've looked at graphs from published papers showing the amount of minerals that get into the plant, and it's a fraction, and the amount that translocate through the plant, and it's a fraction of that. So you end up with mineral deficient plants because of the Roundup. And then also, as every organic student knows, the quality of the soil supports the quality of the plant. And Roundup kills beneficial bacteria in the soil. It promotes soil-based pathogens. It promotes fungal growth. And then basic monoculture destroys the quality of the soil. And so then again, you also have reduction in the nutrients in the crop. So, but there hasn't been a lot of side-by-side comparisons with a lot of details, just the one that I know about.
Well, and let's not forget what those GMOs are being used to make. So it's not just about whether GMO corn or non-GMO corn is better for you. The GMO corn is being used to feed chickens to make chicken nuggets. So do you want to eat a chicken nugget, or do you want to eat some broccoli? I mean, you got to remember the meta argument here. It's not just about the micro, it's also about the macro. It's like, what food are these products being used to make, to say nothing of soil health, water quality, the herbicides, the fungicides, the nitrogen fertilizers, the algae blooms, all the other things that are built on top of it, the 200 million acres of monoculture GMO crops, all that is connected to it. So it's not just about the cellular health, it's also about the macro health and the public health, just to keep the eye on the larger picture.
Aren't scientists and university honest? Wouldn't they tell us if GMOs or the chemicals to grow them were bad for our health and bad for the planet? Saying, aren't the scientists and the universities honest? Wouldn't they tell us if GMOs or the chemicals to grow them were bad for our health and bad for the planet?
I think there are some independent scientists in the academic world who are not funded by industry and who would speak truth to power. And there have been friends of mine in the past who have done just that. I mean, famous, environmentalists. What I don't see is a lot of people in the American scientific community as active on this issue as the Europeans. And I'm not sure exactly why the American scientists haven't been writing about the health effect studies that have come out, why the scientists with the knowledge of toxicology and the knowledge of food science have not been as active on this issue, even though they're decent scientists who, maybe they're busy in other areas of research. I know that there's a group of scientists who just believe in the National Academy's mantra of, well, there's really no problem here. We're talking about not a great difference between traditional breeding and this new kind of breeding. And that may affect a number of people not to step into this arena, because when you step over the National Academy, there are consequences. The journals, for example, don't like to report your research if it goes against the tide of the prominent scientists. In my talk yesterday, I listed a number of prominent scientists, some Nobel Prize winners, who proclaimed that this is a non-issue, namely the safety of GMOs. And I was able to get a couple of articles published that took a long time to get published, like 6 months because of the reviews. But not a lot of people are writing about it. I don't understand exactly why, except the fear of going against the grain.
I think just briefly to get a little bit, just quickly, some history here. During Ronald Reagan, basic deregulation and a lot of defunding of independent research by the feds. So when federal funding got cut, that meant universities had to rely more and more on corporate funding. And that's been true for the last 30 plus years. But more than that, because of a couple of bills that were passed in Congress, Technology Transfer Act of 1986 being the final one, I don't need to give you the details, the ones that were prior, it now actually, if you get federal funding and and a patent emerges from that, even though it was emerged from federal funding, you have to share that with a private corporation. So every one of those colleges now has what's called intellectual property division. Their whole job is to take discoveries from the university, work with a private corporation to get those patents out, and that includes agricultural patents, biotechnology patents. So that's how they're feeding a lot of their research. Additionally, Cornell has been basically Monsanto's tool for the last 30 years that I've been involved in this. Monsanto just gave $27 million to University of Berkeley. We're seeing some effects on that. So by taking away federal dollars, that leaves the field open for corporations, and then they even passed a law saying even though it's federal money, our taxpayer money that did that research, you are forced by law to give that patent to a private company. 1986 Transfer Act. And that has really completely corrupted science in American academia.
What are the concerns regarding genetically engineered insects, animals, trees, and fish, and have they been released anywhere? What are the concerns regarding genetically engineered insects, trees, animals, and fish, and have they been released anywhere?
I could talk a little bit about the mosquito. They have released genetically modified mosquitoes. Oxitec has released the mosquitoes. They're from the UK. And they say they release only the males. They mate with the biting females and produce sterile offspring to reduce the population of the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which carries dengue and Zika. And so it turns out they were lying. They do release a lot of female mosquitoes because their sorting mechanism is flawed. So they release tens of thousands of female biting mosquitoes, and also between 3 and 18% of the offspring are not sterile, up to 18% if it's in the presence of a particular antibiotic, which is in the environment, 3% on normally. I remember I was testifying in Key West at the Mosquito Control Board, trying to get them not to accept the Oxitec mosquito, and a man named Derek from Oxitec was testifying on behalf of Oxitec. And afterwards I asked Derek, I said, have you ever tested the saliva from the mosquito? Because if you get bitten by a mosquito, the saliva enters your bloodstream. And he said, we're just now testing to see if the expressed protein is in the saliva. They had already released the mosquito, millions of them, in Malaysia, Panama, Cayman Islands, and Brazil. But they were just now testing to see if the expressed protein, in other words, they insert the gene, if that protein was expressed in the saliva. And I said to him, you know, there was a study done on a cystic fibrosis cell, and they inserted a gene, and they found up to 5% of the naturally expressing genes changed their levels of expression in the presence of a single inserted gene, which could increase the level of an allergen, a toxin, a carcinogen. Shouldn't you be characterizing the entire saliva of the mosquito to see if it was changed and if that change was dangerous? And his response was brilliant. He said, good idea. So yes, there's plenty of, there's the possibility of environmental displacement, and there's a better and safer alternative in Wolbachia. Other people can talk to that. But the idea of being bitten by a genetically modified mosquito is not something that I savor. And they want to genetically engineer, they wanted to do olive moths, which would leave their larvae in the olives, and then we'd eat the olives, so we'd be eating the actual genetically modified larva, and they forgot to pay attention to that, so that when the European authorities asked about that, they withdrew the application. And these are the brain cells behind introducing an entirely new species that can become part of our ecosystem and bestowed upon all future generations.
As far as trees, just remember, that's all, you know, the less you can control something after you've released it into the environment, the more dangerous it can be. And often the smaller, the more dangerous. So bacteria, it was not in the question, but bacteria, right? Genetically engineered bacteria, that's going to reproduce. You're not going to be able to control that once it's out, right? Now with genetically engineered trees, they live so much longer than plants. They're much more dangerous in many ways than genetically engineered plants. Imagine these trees living for decades, some even longer, shedding their seeds forever. But now those are genetically engineered. So that actually, longevity is another part of the danger calculus on that. We mentioned fish, that you cannot recall them. So the problem with these errors that they've made with fish and others is that you cannot, the precautionary principle is what you should use, because you're not going to be able to recall them, and you're not going to be able to get them back. And ironically, we talk about genetically engineering humans. It's obviously very controversial. I'm obviously not for it, but it's probably far more dangerous for us to genetically engineer bacteria. I mean, there's no people that are talking about bacteria rights or mosquito rights or virus rights, but actually for us, that probably is where these catastrophes are hidden, because once they're out there, there's no way to stop them from multiplying, disseminating, reproducing, and traveling wherever they're going to go. So that is, again, we've said it a few times tonight, that's one of the great dangers of this technology.
I'd like to ask a follow-up
Actually,
question.
Hold on. Actually, why don't we, everyone take a final 2 minutes for a wrap-up statement. So everyone, we've got 10 minutes left, so everyone take 2 minutes each to make your final closing thoughts. Sheldon, you want to start? Okay. Okay, sure. Want to start more?
Oh, Sheldon, okay. Okay. Well, Mike, I think the question of really GMOs, just to expand upon that, and I will try to take 2 minutes, is essentially who has control over our food system. So underlying this entire discussion is the fact that there are actually a very small number of companies that actually produce GMOs. There's maybe 4, possibly 3 that produce GMOs, and those 4 companies, awaiting word of whether the Bayer-Monsanto merger will be approved, essentially control already more than half of the seeds that are in circulation in the world. Many of those are GMO seeds. Not all of them are GMO seeds. We're talking about the big picture. So I think the fundamental question that GMOs lead us to is, who are we going to kind of put our faith in the future of our food at a time of unprecedented environmental stresses in the hands of 4, possibly 3 companies? And this is the subject of my book, Seeds of Resistance, and it's a subject that I hope people think about going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to use this to bring up something that we haven't talked about, which is that as we currently know it, genetic engineering is scientifically incoherent. You may remember there was something called the Human Genome Project. People remember that? Human Genome, we were supposed to have 100,000 genes. Well, at the end of the project, it turned out we had 19,500 genes. Pinot Noir grapes have 40,000, corn has 30,000, and wheat has 100,000. So if you were to take the supposed genes of 5 Nobel Prize winners, it would equal that in a cell of wheat. These are facts. This is not me talking. This is established science. What that proves is that DNA is not the basis for the complexity of life. Each of you has, 20, 30 million cells in you. It all has the same DNA except for your red blood cells, but you have muscle cells, brain cells, toenail cells. The DNA doesn't control that. DNA is one piece. It's not the composer. It's not the conductor. It's not the whole orchestra. It's like the second or first violin section. But meanwhile, this entire technology has been based on that you can manipulate DNA and you're going to actually be able to change major phenotypic traits in organisms. Not true. Everything they promised, changing nitrogen fixation, changing ability to grow in drought, changing nutrition, all of that doesn't work because it's much more complicated than that. I debated Bob Fraley at Monsanto in the Commonwealth Club, and he admitted, frankly, we were wrong in the 1980s. DNA is just one piece of the puzzle. As Jeffrey was saying, there's RNA, there's something called epigenetics, which is all involved in histones and methyl caps. They have their animals like us. We have actually more cells in us that are not us, that are our biome, than we have cells that are us. We have 40 trillion cells that are the bacteria and other organisms us, and only 30 trillion of our own cells. All that's an incredibly complex system. We're not even close to that. It's thinking of the abacus compared to the computer. And that's the amount of complexity that we know is out there, and we're at the abacus stage. And yet they continue this misguided, knowing that they're only engineering, including CRISPR and all these things. They're just playing with one piece of the puzzle, not knowing how it's going to affect the rest of it. That's grossly scientifically negligent, and it represents a danger, not just to our health, but to the environment.
I'm just glad I've got these really smart people to say that kind of stuff, because I certainly couldn't say it. All I know as a humanities person is the way I answer this question is I take English majors out and teach them how to grow food. And you may be surprised to hear that even college students, now remember, college students are statistically among the most educated people in the history of humanity. And yet, ask them where potatoes grow, and they're likely to say on trees, because they've never seen a potato grow, ever. So in addition to all of that, there's also the fact that nobody has any idea where their food comes from. So there are all kinds of approaches to this. One of the approaches I have put my chips on is that getting people to actually get their bodies back into the world is a really useful antidote to this. So you take a bunch of kids out and teach them about growing food, and you don't have to explain genetics to them. They just have an intuitive, there is this part of our body that is not just intellectual, don't forget. There is the intuitive, the spiritual, the aesthetic, all of that is also true. And you take a kid out to a farm and let them cut some eggplants or grow some raspberries or whatever it is, and they don't need to know about genetics, they just know what is the right thing to eat. So there's also that part of it too. I just like to remind us that we've got these other things going on too, and those are worth investing in as well.
I want to start off by saying I'm really excited for Mckay and Mark, new authors on the block. It's great to meet you. Andy, I've been seeing you around for longer than I want to admit. And it's true, that's good news. And I've been admiring, Sheldon, your work for years, and this is the first time we've had a chance to meet and talk, and I've been wanting to meet you. In fact, when they invited me to this, I made sure that I was in the same time slot as you, because I would have moved myself if you were coming at a different time, because I've been wanting to meet you for so long. So you're watching The Real Truth About Health, and you may be seeing a lot of different things to do, a lot of different choices in terms of diet and whatnot. And if you want to be experimental about it, you may want to try one thing at a time, or everything, but if you try one thing at a time, you may want to do this. If you're not already 100% organic, change to 100% organic for several weeks. First, take a diary and write down your energy level, your symptoms, your mood, behavior, all the symptoms, and rate them 1 to 10. And then replace your diet, keep the same foods you're eating, but just change it to organic, and write down every day the percentage of foods that's organic, even the foods themselves, but also your symptoms, your energy level, your mood, behavior, etc. And if what we're seeing around the country is indicative, a certain percentage of people who do this will have life-changing, huge aha experiences as the intractable skin conditions go away, as the digestive problems go away, as the energy increases, as the brain fog recedes, and even in some cases, as you'll see in the film Secret Ingredients, the autistic diagnosis gets taken away. And then we can look at other things based on that new baseline, where it's just removing the GMOs and the toxic chemicals and getting a little more phytonutrients and antioxidants, et cetera, that organic has. So I'd like to make that as my #1 recommendation. Change your diet, switch to organic, and take notes.
Okay, so a couple of things I'd leave you with. One is that the plant genome, where all these changes are being made, is not a Lego system. It's an ecosystem. And as people have said on this panel, far more complex than a Lego system. Lego, you put in the Lego and you don't disturb anything else. With an ecosystem, you can disturb everything else in the system. Every product that's produced has to be rigorously evaluated by an independent agency or independent scientist. Otherwise, I don't trust it, and I don't think you should.